Friends, the title of this lecture is Greek Political Thought, a General Introduction. And I'm not going into a talk on your syllabus because I have already shared you the syllabus on the Google Classroom. So you might have come across the syllabus and the readings in the reference list. And I have already shared with you on Google Classroom the readings for the unit first, and I hope you will submit the review in the prescribed day. So this is a course on political thought. So we will cover some important writers on political philosophy. I hope you already know the difference between theory, thought, and philosophy, which we had already discussed in one of our previous lectures on political theory. I hope all of you might remember. Am I correct? So, today's lecture, we are going to be familiar with Greek political thought and its general features, a background information. Rather than talking about general features, we are going to talk about the background upon which the Greek political thought emerged. So it is little bit historical. It's not an analytical lecture, rather it is basically a lecture that will tell you the history of the evolution of Greek political thinking. So it's a general introduction, some background information that I am going to provide you in this lecture. And friends, we know that we are all Homo sapiens, right? We are all Homo sapiens. And it is believed, and the paleoanthropologist will tell you that Homo sapiens are the most successful hominids which originated between 2 lakh and 3 lakh years ago. So our Homo sapien ancestors originated between 2 lakh and 3 lakh years ago. But there were other hominids like the Neanderthals, Homo habilis, Homo erectus. And it is believed that paleoanthropologists classify human societies before men began to write history into two. Before Homo sapiens began to write about their own history, paleoanthropologists divide our prehistory into two. And all those time where we had no history writing are generally called prehistory. So I'm talking about prehistory. And historians, anthropologists, and paleoanthropologists divide our prehistory into two, which you might have studied in your school curriculum. One is the Paleolithic and the other one is the Neolithic. The Paleolithic era began 2 million years ago. Paleolithic era began almost 2 million years ago and ended 12,000 years ago. And friends, during the Paleolithic era, hominids, our early ancestors, hominids, lived very close to the nature. They lived very close to the nature. Life was all shaped by practical necessities. And early hominids looked at the stars and counted it, but they were not able to count it. And they hadn't any idea about why the stars are there in the sky. And our early hominids looked at the nature. They looked at the trees, animals, plants, and they had no idea why these are all so seemed to be. Why they are all what they are. They had no idea, friends. They had no idea about why they are seemed so. And friends, they weren't at all bothered about anything in the nature. Life was motivated by bare minimum practical necessities. Eat and sleep. But friends, all of a sudden, some 12,000 years ago, what happened? In our prehistoric era, some 12,000 years ago, friends, all of a sudden, something new happened. Imagine 12,000 years ago. And what happened? You think, what happened some 12,000 years ago? Some 12,000 years ago, a Neolithic revolution began to unfold in human societies. And historians makes it clear that Neolithic phenomenon originated in the Near East. Near East is a terminology that involves geographical areas in Western Asia, Turkey, and Egypt. And Neolithic revolution happened in a place otherwise called Mesopotamia. Friends, you might have come across this information in the history classes. That Mesopotamia was basically an area between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. That is in modern day Iraq, present day Iraq. And Mesopotamia is often said to be the cradle of civilization. Cradle of civilization. And friends, the history of Mesopotamia is tied closely to the history of Mesopotamia is closely tied to the history of modern day nations like Egypt, Iran, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, Gulf states, Turkey. My point is that for the first time, Homo sapiens began to settle in these places some 12,000 years ago. And these places are called Near East, or otherwise, in history classes, we refer to these areas in history classes as the old world. Such a word did not exist now. We don't know anything about such a world now. One and only thing that we know about this area is pyramid now. We know something about their civilization is because there is what may be called pyramids, Egyptian pyramids. You might have come across mummies. mummification of human body. And friends, it was some 12,000 years ago, humans began to cultivate a variety of plants, settled life. They started sedentary, settled life, wheat, barleys, peas, lentils. So many, varieties of plants were cultivated. High cities emerged. Cities emerged. Cities with the population density emerged. Centralized political and economic authority emerged some 12,000 years ago. There were the organization and the emergence of regional states. Regional states, monumental architectures were built, writing developed. You might remember cuneiform, hieroglyphics. They were the first languages human beings invented. Then higher learning. These were the features of these societies. And their civilizations originated nearby river valleys. For example, Nile River, Euphrates and Tigris, Indus Valley, or Yellow River. And they were all host to several regional states like the Sumer, the Assyrians, the Kassites, the Cyrus. And finally, these civilizations ended by the birth of a famous conqueror. All these civilizations ended by the birth of a famous conqueror. We call him with a salutation called the Great. Do you remember the person? Alexander the Great. In 333 BC, Alexander the Great invaded all these places. And their history ended by the conquest of Alexander. And Alexander was a Greek. He was a Greek. And the conquest of Alexander, with the conquest of Alexander over the Occident, and these Near East societies were called Occidental societies. And Alexander was not part of the Occident. Alexander was part of the Orient. Orient means the West, the Western civilization. A civilization that is different in outlook towards the world, in worldview, in scientific temperament, everything. The West is different, and the Orient is also very different. Occident is different. Occident is these places which I mentioned to you a short while ago. And with Alexander's conquest of these places, we can say that Occident ended and the Orient began. That Orient began to conquer the Occident. Or otherwise say, the West began to conquer the East. And the Occident or the Near East, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, all these, societies had great monumental structures like, massive mountain-like structures, pyramids. They had invented writing. They had mathematics of primitive form. They had idea of time. They had idea of gods and heavens. But friends, something happened. All of a sudden. And a new era began in human history. That era is called the classic Greek era. The classic Greek era. All of a sudden, friends, the Neolithic world entered or fell into the hand of Greek miracle. Historians call this Greek miracle. Then a Greek miracle happened all of a sudden. And the Greek miracle or the Greek world is split into two. The Greek world is split into two. That Greek world began by 600 BC. Greek world began by 600 BC. And this Greek world, which started almost 600 BC, is split into two. One is the Hellenic Greece and second is the Hellenistic Greece. You should be able to remember that distinction, friends. The first one is the Hellenic Greece, second is the Hellenistic Greece. And the Hellenic Greece is the Greece before Alexander's death. And his death was in the year BC 323. 323 BC. He died in Babylonia, I think. He died in June 323 BC. And the era of Greece, the history of Greece, till the death of Alexander the Great is called the Hellenic Greece. And that is said to be the golden age of Greece. That is said to be the zenith of the Greek Enlightenment, an era where Greeks had produced some masterpiece works. And then there is a Hellenistic Greece, friends, a Hellenistic Greece. And what is that Hellenistic Greece? That Hellenistic Greece is a Greece created by the conquest of Alexander. What was his contribution, friends? He went to different parts of the world where he introduced to that world what Greece was, what their culture was, what their philosophy was, what their science was. And the rest of the world came to know more about Greece through the conquest of Aristotle. So Aristotle had created in other part of the world what may be called a Greek worldview. That Greek culture blended with the cultures of other societies and a new world emerged. That is called the Hellenistic Greece. So it refers to Greeks and other people or other societies who lived during the period after Alexander's death or Alexander's conquest. That is Hellenistic Greece. And friends, the so-called Neolithic civilization fell into the Occident, or otherwise called the West. And around the shores of the Aegean Sea, a Greek-speaking people originated. And they started a unique civilization that maybe historians say some 600 BC, before Christ, some 600 years ago, before the birth of Jesus Christ, some 600 years ago, what may be called a Greek-speaking people originated and started a unique civilization. And given its proximity to Egypt and Mesopotamia, and this place, Greece had a close proximity with the old world in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And Greek civilization derived some of the unique features of the old world, or otherwise called the Near East. That is, the Near East had tremendous influence in the Greek world. But friends, the Greek civilization emerged as a set of decentralized city-states. It retained a loose social structure until the Alexander Great. And it was the Alexander Great unified the whole of Greece under his command in the 4th century BC. Before Alexander, Greek's world was called the world of polis, city-states. Athens was one of the famous city states. Carthage, Miletus, Ionia, Sparta, they were all, friends, some polis or otherwise called city states. And it had a pre-imperial period. That imperial period began with the rise of the Alexander the Great. And the pre-imperial period began from 600 BC to 300 BC. 600 BC to 300 BC, that was called the pre-imperial period of Greece. That is said to be the Hellenic Greece. I told you. As we know, friends, Paleolithic and the Neolithic people, as I told you in the beginning, they looked at the stars, but didn't understand why during starry nights the stars winked at you. They were clueless why the stars in the starry night winked at you. They were surprised. They had no idea in the Paleolithic world, people had no idea why the stars in the sky wink at you. They didn't know, the Paleolithic or Neolithic people didn't know why the fragrant breeze from the mountain top hugged you and kissed you. They weren't aware, friends, they weren't aware why beyond the deep blue sky, what secret the nature had concealed for you. Friends, the Paleolithic people or the Neolithic people weren't aware why there is sun and the slant rays of the early morning sun sparkle on the dews on the flowers. Why this happened? They had no idea of ultraviolet rays that comes to you directly from the sun. They had no idea. But the morning sun sparkled on the dews on the flowers. So they weren't aware of the science of, why the sun that happened in the world. Why the lunar eclipse? Why the solar eclipse? They had no idea. And friends, that the point is that people in the Paleolithic or the Neolithic or generally prehistoric period were not scientific thinking people. And the scientific thinking for the first time in human history originated in the Greek world. You might have seen that in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, there were great civilizations, but there were no science. There were no scientific thinking. There were no philosophy. There were no logic. There were no rational explanations to things in the nature. And it started only in the Greek world, some 600 BC ago. You will see that the Greeks started thinking about all these things. So friends, now science, scientific thinking, philosophy, logics, these are popularized, and all of us are some kinds of scientists. You are all scientists now. You are all philosophers now. Because right from, a mother's womb, we are part of a learning community. So I will read you an excerpt from Carl Sagan and his famous book, Pale Blue Dot. And Carl Sagan was called America's most effective salesman of science by Times Magazine. And Carl Sagan has written a famous book, The Pale Blue Dot. And this book was written by Carl Sagan inspired from an image, a photo, an image taken by Voyager 1st on 14th February 1990. That was a spacecraft that was departing from our solar system. And the Voyager 1st took an image of the planet Earth from 6.4 billion kilometers away. Imagine, friends, today's scientific thinking has gone that way. These kinds of things were unknown to people in the prehistoric period. You see, upon Carl Sagan's suggestion, NASA has by default enabled Voyager first to take a photo of planet Earth, and it took that photo from 6.4 billion kilometers away. And this photo that which Voyager first took, according to Carl Sagan, was a pale blue dot, a pale blue dot. And this picture was captioned in his book saying like this: the pale blue dot of Earth, that is here, that is home, that is us. And Sagan wrote about man and his civilization, about man and his scientific thought, about man and his organized human living, social living. That was an excerpt I will read for you in this lecture about this, the worldview of modern man, the worldview of Homo sapiens. And look, by looking at this pale blue dot image of took by Voyager first, Carl Sagan was saying like this: look again at that dot that was taken from 6.4 billion kilometer away by Voyager first. That was a photo of Earth from above. Look again at that dot. That is here. That is home. That is us. On it. Some beautiful sentences, friends. On it. Everyone you love, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and a forager, every hero and a coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politicians, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Look at the beauty of sentences. And he continues, friends, the earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Look at the imagination Carl Sagan had. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel, that pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. What a beautiful sentence. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged positions in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate, visit, yes, settle, not yet, like it or not. For the moment, the earth is where we make our stand. Friends, these are the lines taken from the pale blue dot of Earth. Look, friends, human civilization has advanced that much. From where? From the Neolithic and the Paleolithic world. Thinking began. Look at the beauty of thinking in Carl Sagan's writing about man, about nature, about science, about logic, about our organized social life. It is taken from Carl Sagan, Pale Blue Dot, published in the year 1994. Friends, and for the first time, the first society to think like this, the first human society to think like this, which I quoted from Carl Sagan's book, Pale Blue Dot. It was the Greece. It was the Hellenic Greece. They developed theory for the first time in human history about man and nature. Greek developed science for the first time in human history. They developed abstract notions about nature, about stars, about planetary systems, and about everything. They called it, but friends, they used a word to refer to their activity. They called it not science. It was not science that we call today. They call it natural philosophy. Natural philosophy. For them, science was natural philosophy. Philosophy about the nature. Philosophy about what is in the nature, what is around us. So they called it the natural philosophy or the philosophy of the nature. They explained nature of trees, nature of plants, animals, solid materials, rivers, mountains, breeze, storms, etc. and proposed rational explanations. They even investigated human relationship, love, family, and even the state. But they proposed theories about social institutions from the prism of natural philosophy. Friends, for the Greek people, state was a natural institution. For the Greek people, family was a natural institution. For the Greek people, social relationship was natural. That was, their worldview. So they viewed state, the dominant social institution, as a natural institution. And for them, state is not man-made. Clear? State is not man-made. And during the Greek period, friends, during the Hellenic period, state was the dominant institution, but state did not promote any kind of natural philosophy. Any kind of natural philosophy. But in the Near East, Mesopotamia, Egyptian civilization, you will see that kings promoted science, scientific thinking. But in the Greek world, you will see that state did not promote scientific thinking. And it was the Greek people who invented, who instituted what may be called modern day university-like institutions, institutions of learning. But these institutions of learning, Lyceum, for example, these institutions of learning were private institutions, not public funded institutions. There were no public support or funding for schooling, for higher learning, for libraries, or for observations of stars. There were no public funding, friends. The natural philosophers received no public employment, no public support. Natural philosopher of Greece was an independent operator. It appears that natural philosophers of Greece either possessed independent wealth or earned a living as private teachers. That was their way of living. And one point that is very important for our lecture is that for the Greek, natural philosophy hadn't any responsibility towards society. Natural philosophy hadn't any responsibility towards society. Natural philosophy was practiced by the elites. And the elites proposed abstract theories about nature. about everything. But their ideas, their notions had little practical applications. They didn't attach any social roles to their knowledge. The Greeks didn't attach any social roles to their knowledge. They just propose abstract notions about nature. And for example, Plato, about whom we will study in this course, in this semester, Plato criticized the idea that one should study geometry or astronomy in pursuit of practical benefits for agriculture, for military affairs, for navigation or calendar. You should study geometry or astronomy was a bad idea for Plato. So now it seems very intriguing and very interesting, friends, how the Greeks developed this natural philosophy, the knowledge about nature. It was, friends, it was Thales of Miletus, some 600 BC, a Greek mathematician, an astronomer, and pre-Socratic philosopher. A pre-Socratic philosopher. He was born in Miletus in Ionia. Ionia was a place in Asia Minor. He was considered to be one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. Thales of Miletus. M-I-L-E-T-U-S. Thales of T-H-A-L-E-S. Thales of Miletus. He is otherwise called the father of science. The father of science. And it was Thales who, for the first time in human history, made some claims about nature. Before that, there were only magic, or what may be called superstition, about what we see in the nature. People only had irrational explanations. And for the first time in human history, the first person to propose some kinds of rational explanations to nature was Thales of Miletus. That was, happened in 600 BC. And he connected Nile flooding with Etesian winds. He proposed that Nile is flooding because of some kinds of winds. That was the first known rational explanation to a thing in the nature. That is, Nile is flooding because of some changes in the wind pattern. Before that, people didn't inquire why the Nile river flood. And friends, this Thales' idea about Nile river flooding was challenged by Herodotus, a Athenian historian, and he savagely attacked the notion of Thales. But friends, you will see that a number of schools later emerged in ancient Greece. A number of theoretical schools emerged in ancient Greece. They proposed theories about nature. They tried to demystify nature. They proposed what may be called a concept of nature. They proposed what may be called a concept of nature. And the Greek believed nature may appear self-evident to us. Nature may appear self-evident to us. All what happens in the nature is priori. P-R-I-O-R-I. Keep in mind that particular word, priori. Nature is a priori, that you should not inquire into certain things in the nature because that is there. And it appears to be what it is. And it requires no proof. And you should not inquire into the proof of such things because that is futile, and you should inquire what are the effects of that particular thing in the nature. So it was the Greeks who proposed what may be called priori. So this kind of a notion about nature was unknown to people before the Greek civilization. So a naturalistic explanation began to start in the Greek world. A naturalistic explanation. And friends, Before the pre-Socratic world, there were Thales of Miletus. Then there were the Pythagoreans. Pythagoreans was a school of thought in ancient Greece, centered in Italy. They formed an organized religious brotherhood. And there were Pythagoras, and they connected nature with mathematics. And they tried to explain natural phenomenon in terms of mathematics. That's Pythagoreans. Then there were the atomists and the philosophers of change. Historians say that after the Thales of Miletus and the Pythagoreans, there were some other very powerful school of thought called the atomists and the philosophers of change. Then there were the Hippocratic school, the Hippocratic medical tradition in ancient Hellenic Greece. A 5th century physician, Hippocrates of Kos, C-O-S, the Hippocrates of Kos started a medical tradition. And friends, ancient Greek people were natural philosophers. They initiated abstract inquiries into nature. But friends, there were no unity in their endeavors. That is, there were so many schools of thought. I have told you, Thales of Miletus and others. There were the Pythagoreans. There were the atomists. There were the philosophers of change. There were the Hippocratic school. So many schools. But there were no consensus. There were no unity between these schools of thought. And their thinking was scientific also. But they disagreed on almost everything. And then nothing like a sustained scientific unified theory didn't emerge in the ancient Greece. But by 4th century BC, something new happened in the ancient Greece. What was it? Friends, two great philosophers changed the entire history of Greek world. It was Plato and Aristotle. Before Plato, there was no consensus in Greek cosmology or Greek scientific thinking or Greek natural philosophy. There were no consensus in Greek science, in Greek natural philosophy, on Greek astronomy. There were no unity of thought. Plato, by 4th century BC, with his geometrical astronomy, founded a new era in Hellenic Greece. Plato was a student of Socrates. Socrates was a 5th century philosopher. And it was Socrates who brought back philosophy down from the skies. Before that, all philosophers looked at the skies to understand secrets in the nature. It was Socrates who brought down philosophy from skies. He focused his attention on examining human experiences, human relationship, human life. It was Socrates who started studying human life, human social experiences. Before that, friends, no philosophers were engaged with, human experiences. They all looked at the sky. They looked above and started to inquire what is in the nature. what is in the sky. And his student Plato, for Plato, geometry was important. His philosophy was a form of intellectual discipline. Am I audible? Friends?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Audible, right? Okay. Friends, what I'm saying is that Plato, for Plato, geometry was very important. Geometry was key to Plato's theory of nature. And Plato himself was a philosopher, a natural philosopher, but he was not a serious geometer or a mathematician. But he had some contributions to this area also. And nor he was an astronomer, but he had some contributions. And everything again changed. By 3rd century BC, it was a turn of Aristotle. Aristotle was a student of Plato. Aristotle was a watershed in the whole history of ancient Hellenic natural philosophy. And Aristotle's work encompassed logic, politics, physics, cosmology, psychology, natural history, anatomy, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, so many areas. I think he had written more than 100 books. Aristotle had written more than 100 books. So Aristotle represented the culmination of Hellenic Enlightenment. And his scientific worldview existed for almost 2000 years. Almost 2000 years, his legacy continued in human world. And it was only in the 19th century Aristotle's idea of nature has been challenged for the first time. From a sociological point of view, friends, Aristotle's philosophy was centered around his school, Lyceum. Lyceum was a school founded by Aristotle, which did not get any funding from Athenian state. And Aristotle recognized that there should be a distinction between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge. There should be a distinction between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge. And Aristotle said, the root to knowledge is sensory perception. That your senses should understand things. So proof is very important. For anything you propose, for any theory you propose, proof through your senses is very important. So friends, Aristotle's writings had provided basis for higher learning in various other cultures after his death. And the cultures of late antiquity, Islam, and European Middle Ages were tremendously influenced by the writings of Aristotle. His theories of cosmology are basically theological. So to that extent, that is, his theories of cosmology are rooted in theology. That's why, friends, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism somehow used Aristotle to make their religion scientific. So the intellectual legacy of Aristotle's studies was far reaching because his analysis had clarity, his cosmological comprehensiveness, his standards about scientific thinking were all time tested. And the point is that Alexander was the student of Aristotle. That was an interesting thing. And Alexander did square opposite to what Aristotle preached. That he went for conquest. And he conquered several parts of the world. And both of them died within a year. Within a year of one another, both of them died. Alexander died 323 BC and Aristotle 322 BC. They were teacher and the student. But friends, the world that immediately followed after the death of Alexander and Aristotle was far different. Scientifically, socially, and politically, the world that followed the death of Aristotle and Alexander was very different from the societies they had lived and inhabited. So, friends, this is a small, lecture on a background about Greek political thought. Tomorrow we will talk about the features of ancient Greek Hellenic political thought. Now the floor is open for discussion, friends.